Welcome to everybody watching this. I'm Andrew from SDHistCon. I work on a number of things there, but in particular running the Conflicts of Interest online portion of our website where we run historical gaming articles. Clio here writes a ton of great historical gaming articles on his site, Clio's Board Games. There's a link to that in the text chat here. And we're just going to talk about creating historical gaming content, and in particular about his process and how that works for him. So to start with, Clio, what got you into writing about historical games?
Hi, so first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great opportunity. Very excited for this chat. So when I started writing my blog, I was actually still writing about board games as my main job, if so you will, because I was doing a master's thesis in history, and the topic of that thesis was the Cold War in board games. So for a short but exciting time, part of my main occupation was to play Twilight Struggle, Wir sind das Volk, and other exciting games. And as the thesis was coming to an end, I thought that was an interesting thing and I wanted to keep that up. And yeah, so I started a blog and I have been doing it ever since, which is a bit over 6 years now.
That's very cool. And why the name Clio's Board Games in particular?
So for those of you who know their Greek mythology, Clio is the muse of history. So, I mean, the Greeks have muses. For each of the arts or sciences, there's one particular mythological being that inspires the people doing it, and Clio is the one who is responsible for history. So I thought in my academic ivory tower that everybody knew this, and of course it would be obvious that Clio is an inspiration and not me personally. But turns out that real people in the normal world don't know that, at least not all of them. So people just said, okay, Clio, that's you. And then they started calling me that, and yeah, here we go. So yeah, normally I'm known as Clio now on the online spaces of history and board gaming.
Fair enough. Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned the your thesis in Twilight Struggle, and I really liked an article you wrote about the decolonization card and how that sort of led you into Twilight Struggle and led you into some of this. Can you maybe go through a little bit of that and that background?
Absolutely. So that's also when I was still in university. Back in my undergrads, I was writing another thesis, the bachelor thesis at that time, not about board games, but about the decolonization of Angola. And I was learning a lot about decolonization at the time. And I thought it would be fascinating if there was a board game about it. So I Googled decolonization board game, and I didn't find an actual board game about it. What I did find, however, was the decolonization card of Twilight Struggle. And that was fascinating to me because, I mean, I was always interested in the Cold War. I mean, the decolonization of Angola happens in a Cold War context. And it was, just intriguing to see this board game that had an historical event like this condensed to bare essentials, also influenced for a very specific perspective on a card. And this is how I got to know about Twilight Struggle, and I got the game shortly afterward, made all of my friends play it with me, and that was one of the first deep historical board games that I played. And of course, the card is not only interesting from a game perspective, but also what it embodies from a historical perspective. It's just a very specific historic moment, say in the late 1950s, when the Eisenhower administration sees decolonization particularly as a threat, because whenever a colony becomes independent, when the local when there's local rule there instead of European rule, then this colony is likely to be influenced by the Soviet Union, will turn communist, something like that. And this threat is also echoed on the other side in Moscow, where the Khrushchev administration sees this as a great opportunity and expects the same thing to happen. Countries become independent, and of course they will follow the Soviet Union's model of development. As it turns out, they were both wrong, and the perspective also changes very soon afterward. Already the next American administration under Kennedy looks at decolonization very differently and sees it as an opportunity for the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know in that article too, so you mentioned a little bit of it there, but you were looking for sort of at first for a wider game on decolonization. Has anything really been done on that front since then? And do you think, like, could that be a game if not?
I'm not aware of anything that is really about decolonization as a whole or on a grand level, say the decolonization of Africa, which all happens in a few decades. There, of course, are smaller case studies, if you so will.
Hmm.
Sometimes, yeah, it's more on one country or a specific battle. I mean, if it's a more military-centered thing, for example, I have no idea how to pronounce this, but Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, where the
Hmm.
battle between the Vietnamese decolonization movement and the French happens in 1954, has seen treatment, for example, by Kim Kanger. There is, of course, the Gandhi coin game about the decolonization
Hmm.
of India, which is probably the closest about a large sweeping treatment of decolonization from its scope. I mean, it lasts over 30 years. And
Hmm.
I mean, India was the biggest of all colonies, the most populous. But I'm not aware of anything that really zooms out entirely. But there's more of that happening now. I mean, definitely more games that have the local conflicts in one country, in one colony.
For sure. And to go back to the card, you've done that a number of times, writing an article about a specific card, and that's really interesting to me. Of like pulling so much analysis in on a particular card, looking at the history around it, the different sources around it. Why do you like doing that?
First of all, and most importantly, it's just my love for card-driven games, for CDGs.
Mm. Hmm.
That's probably my favorite board game mechanic at all overall. I've played a lot of CDGs, and I just love them in all their different forms, be it two-player like Twilight Struggle or multiplayer like Here I Stand. If it's just a very
Hmm.
short thing, say 13 days, or really yeah, long involved things, say Weimar. Doesn't matter if you have one deck for everybody or specific decks for each player. I just love CDGs, and so whenever I write about something, it's likely that I know a CDG on the
Hmm.
topic and that I already think about the card that I want to include. On a more pragmatic note, the card just forces the designer to condense an event or a process or a person um, onto some essentials. What does that mean? And you need to put everything on that card, which means it's pretty simple to understand. So if I want to write something, then the card effect normally is very clear. So even if I haven't played the game, I normally get the idea what the card does and what the historical perspective therefore is. And it's also easy for the reader to understand. You don't need to know the game. I
Hmm.
don't need to explain all the mechanics for something that is happening. You just look at the card and you see, that's the card text. Maybe there are some icons that are quickly explained, and you see, okay, this is what the designer thinks is the essence of this historical process.
For sure. On that front, there obviously are a number of different ways that CDGs approach it, but I'm wondering what you think about the dual use event cards in particular, the things that show up in like a lot of the coin titles, where it could be this goes one way or this goes the other way. How do you think that compares to a card that is this thing happened?
I think that's a natural development out of the this thing happens because when you look at things, then sometimes you think that's very easy. This
Hmm.
event is represented like that, and then you think about it, and it's not so easy anymore. So even in games where you only have single use events, the designers often grapple with that. In Wir sind das Volk, which is about the two German states of the Cold War, the
Hmm.
designers mention their design notes that yeah, it was sometimes not so easy to assign it. For example, they have a card on the 1972 Summer Olympics, which were held in Munich, and this
Hmm.
card yeah gives some infrastructure to Bavaria and yeah improves the prestige of West Germany because of the Olympics being held there. But then they said, is that even true? Was it not rather um, disadvantageous for the prestige of the country, because the 72 Olympics are not only famous for sports, but also because of the terrorist attack on the Israeli athletes there. Was it not a debacle because West Germany could not protect the athletes? Or on the other hand, you could see it in a way that the Arab terrorists who were aligned with the Soviet Union or East Germany, in the eyes of most of the world, stained their cause, which may have been just, by doing this indiscriminate violence. So maybe it was disadvantageous for the prestige of East Germany then again, so that's good for West Germany. So you can do a lot of dialectics on that. And the dual use event cards go a little bit around that, by which by offering just two different interpretations or two different ways in which an event can pan out. For me as a writer, of course, that's harder to use, because you don't have the one interpretation of the designer and rather two, and you don't know which one the designer prefers, or if the designer says this is the historical one, but I also could have seen it turn out differently in history. So writing about that is a bit harder, but sometimes also fruitful.
For sure. Another thing I think is interesting with your site is that you really cover a really broad range of historical games. You do some of the real classic hex encounter, kinetic warfare stuff, but you also do a lot of stuff that is not straightforward kinetic warfare stuff, that is more social movements or protests and that sort of stuff. I'm wondering, do you see a difference between those types of things in terms of like what you like about playing them, writing about them, or is it all just history to you?
I'm a bit not quite ready to call myself a war gamer, because I'm not even that interested in war, which is funny. I just attended a convention in January in which I did warfare for 4 days straight on the board. But I'm more interested in conflict as such, which can be a lot of different kinds of conflict. Of course, military conflict, a political conflict, but also social conflict. And we're just left with games that have been traditionally very centered on warfare, on statecraft. I play them a lot and I enjoy them, but I think it's exciting that people who take their history seriously, who take the subject of their game seriously, now also do other games. So the advantage that the traditional war games had, that somebody really did not only use it as window dressing for their games, but wanted to engage with it on a very serious level, are now also used by other people who are more interested in different kinds of things. So it's great that the hobby is broadening in that way, which doesn't mean there should be fewer games about war and statecraft, just there should be more games about other things as well.
For sure. You brought up statecraft there, and that was something else I was going to ask you about. I love the series you've done of leadership ratings for different presidents and prime ministers and even one chancellor. What led to you doing that, and are you going to do more of those?
So it came up because of my usual process of how I decide on which articles to do. I typically look at events that have special anniversaries, and there was the 300-year anniversary of Robert Walpole becoming Britain's first prime minister coming up. So I thought, hey, it would be a nice thing to look at the office of the prime minister and then assess its first, the first incumbent on how well he did there. And so I built a rating system that is hopefully robust enough to apply to a lot of different kind of leaders. So I mean, I used it for Robert Walpole, who was prime minister over 300 years ago, but I also used it to John F. Kennedy, who is a US president that some of the older people around still remember from their childhood. And I think it works. So that's very nice. My challenge is to assess each of those leaders by one game only. So I have to find one game that really encompasses everything that the respective leader did, which is not so easy. And I've had a lot of fun so far. I have had nobody in my comments saying, oh my God, I totally disagree. This was a horrible leader, got nothing done, or got some things done, but the things they got done were awful. And I'll see if maybe there will be more controversy in the future. But I'm definitely going to do a little bit more of that.
For sure. And also on the subject of statecraft, like that seems like a topic that's really growing in the gaming space. I mean, of Churchill and then Versailles and now Prime Minister, Mr. President. There seems to be a lot of interest in sort of putting players in these roles of leaders and not just military leaders. And do you see that trend rising? Do you think there's more room for more games like that?
Oh, definitely more room for that. I think it was mostly a bit forgotten in the meantime. If you look at the very old war games, say of the early 1970s,
Hmm.
Jim Dunnigan's designs published at SPI, there were a lot of those. I think there was even a series called the Statecraft
Oh,
series,
okay. Oh, interesting. I hadn't
something
heard
like
that.
that.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then in the late 70s and 1980s, that fell a bit out of fashion. But now that the hobby is broadening again, um, there are more things like that coming up, and I'm excited to see that.
For sure. Do you have a particular? What would be your favorite statecraft game?
Whew. I've been playing that a lot. Those kind of games, so it's hard to say. Overall, I think my very favorite game is still Here I Stand, which is just
Mm,
a very
mhm,
sweeping and very epic experience. Was excited to play that again a month ago. It takes a day if you play the full scenario, so yeah, you definitely need a few people who have a lot of time on their hands. Yeah, but if you get that to the table, that's always a great experience. My most recent board gaming obsession has been Weimar by Matthias
mm,
Kramer,
mhm,
which is about the Weimar Republic of the interwar years in Germany. And yeah, that's also a great experience, which is not only statecraft because the players represent political parties. So
mhm,
those who are actually in power in government get to do a little bit of statecraft and get to negotiate treaties with external powers. But there's also a lot of bickering about who gets to go to parliament, who dominates public opinion.
mhm,
The Democratic parties try to keep the republic afloat, and the not so democratic parties try to undermine it by establishing councils in the Soviet style or right wing regimes. So there's a lot of political conflict going on. And of course, that also leads to a lot of table talk.
mhm.
Yeah. To cooperate with people or to thwart other players. So that's also great fun.
For sure. Yeah, and you mentioned Here I Stand there. I read your convention report on that, and you wound up playing with just 3 people, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm curious about A, how was that as an experience, and B, how do you feel about that? And not just for that, but for all sorts of games, the coin series and so on. If you don't have the full player count, you have people representing multiple factions. And I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts on uh, does that work historically? Is it possible for a player to really represent shifting names of very different sides?
Um, I think those are definitely two different questions. Does it work
Okay.
as a game, and does it
Yeah.
work in history? So,
Hmm.
as a game, I mean, exert caution, maybe read about other people's experiences. I mean, here is
Hmm.
and it's a 6-player game with the full complement. That is great. I think it also works great with 3 players. So each of the players has 2 factions. Then it doesn't work so well with 4 or 5 when some people
Hmm.
have 2 factions and others only one. That's just a little bit asymmetrical and not that great an experience. And then I think I'd rather play another game that is good for 4 or 5. Yeah, if you have multiple factions in Here I Stand, then of course, yeah, all the friction that would normally going on between those, even though they are,
Hmm.
yeah, mostly allied, goes away. So, for example, um, 2 of the factions in Here I Stand are the Habsburgs and the Papacy, and the
Hmm.
Habsburgs, as the prime champions of Catholicism in Europe, are normally very close to the papacy. They want to cooperate, they want to get things done together, but of course, there are things on which they disagree. For example,
Hmm.
the papacy sometimes wants to grant divorce to Henry VIII of England.
Hmm.
And yeah, Henry VIII is normally very keen on that and is willing to reimburse the papacy very generously for it. So in a 6-player game, the papal player is normally likely to negotiate for that with Henry and might extract a hefty price. But as that is rather detrimental to the Habsburgs. If you only have a 3-player game, then maybe those negotiations are not going to happen. So there's definitely less friction there. And but in the end, how many roles you have in the game is always a bit simplifying. Obviously, there were more than 6 factions in Europe at the time, and you can also say that the Habsburgs were not a unified actor, because different interests from, say, the Spanish noblemen or the Austrian ones or the Flemish ones. So amalgamating all of them into a Habsburg faction is also a simplification. So I would not be too bothered about historical accuracy. I mean, think about it, reflect on it. But yeah, it's a board game. It's not the definitive historical treatment.
For sure. So we've got about 8 minutes left here or so. If any audience members have questions, please put them either in the YouTube comments or in the Discord, and we can get to that. But let's talk about the after action reports. You wrote a really nice article for us at COI Online and your site as well about the art of after action reports and taking sort of a different approach there, incorporating polls, incorporating some material written from perspectives of people at the time. I'm wondering, how obviously that's a very intensive process. How do you feel about it looking back, and do you plan to do it again?
Oh, it's definitely a lot of work. So, I mean, writing an after action report takes a lot of time anyway, if you don't just give a quick summary. And the first one I did was for a full campaign of Unconditional Surrender. Now, the Board Game Geek page of Unconditional Surrender lists playtime for the game between 50 and 100 hours. So you already spent a lot of time just playing it. And I mean, writing about it, I did about 30 articles or so that were full historical documents on the matter. Also, that took a lot of time. In those, I tried to embody a lot of different historical perspectives, particularly those that are normally not represented in a traditional after-action report. A traditional after-action report is either written from the perspective of the player themselves, so they say, this is what I did, these were my moves, or they do it from the perspective of whoever they're embodying. So, for example, you play a game on the Battle of Gettysburg, and you're playing the Confederate side, and then you write it as if you were General Lee. But I don't want to do it a little bit differently and rather write from perspectives that are not so well covered. So, for example, my very first article was a diary entry by a Belgian school teacher who deplored the war because, now France and Germany were duking it out on Belgian territory again, and she had to suffer for it. Or I did one that I particularly liked was a propaganda leaflet from the Italian propaganda department. In this game, it turned out that Italy joined the war on the Allied side, so they were fighting against Germany. And so I, made a little leaflet in German black letter font. And in a slightly antiquated German that urged Germans to abandon the Nazi regime and join the Allies instead. So that was also fun to do.
For sure.
These were a lot of work. I've only done it once because this just takes a lot of time, and in my future community games I just refrained from that. It's a community game because of what you alluded to before already. I didn't make the decisions myself. So I played the game, I used Vassal for that, so I did it in a digital fashion, because setting it up for 50 to 100 hours, that would have taken me a year. And my table needs to be used for other things every once in a while in between. But whenever there was a strategic decision coming up, I didn't decide myself. So I put a Twitter poll on. So the entire game was in a very, very long Twitter thread. And whenever there was something to decide, should the Axis attack this country first or rather go in a different direction, I made a poll out of it. And people could discuss it and they could vote for it. And then I enacted whatever they had decided, which was very interesting because, decisions were made by committee, so to speak. And it was also a great way of interacting with people. I had a committed community of people who just followed this and voted on every poll or discussed on every poll. And yeah, so I think that was a great community experience. And particularly because it was done during the early times of the pandemic. So I think people were just very excited to have something to engage in a social way when everybody was stuck at home. And yeah, then I did a similar community thing, which was a Here I Stand game. But in that case, there were only 6 people who could actively participate. And I mean, a number of people who were just spectators. And each of the 6 players gave me a briefing, so to speak, of what they wanted me to achieve with their faction. And then I also enacted that in respective or digital implementation. But then, for example, the Habsburgs would say, suppress Protestant heresy in Germany, and then I would see how exactly that would work. It was also great fun.
For sure. That's very cool. We've got a good question here in the chat from Natalia. She says, you mentioned that you plan your post by checking historical events like anniversaries and such. Is there anything we can expect for 2024 that you already have planned and want to talk about here?
Yeah, so what is going to come up in March is my last post in my 1848 series about the European revolutions of that year, which extended into 1849. So that's 175 years since then. And as its last post, it will be the story of how the last remnants of those revolutions were suppressed and extinguished.
Very cool. And I know that you often, I like that in your posts, you often cite sources and further reading materials. And to me, that's interesting in taking this beyond just talking about the games to talking about this in the whole span of history. Why is that important for you to do?
As said, I came out of academic writing when I started it, so not having a lot of footnotes and referencing everything that I did to a source was already a big step in terms of accessibility. But my pedantic self was like, but at least give people something that they can get more information if they want. And at least for me, when I play a game about a subject, historical subject, it's often like that I want to know more about it afterward. So I pick up a book on it, and if that's the same for other people, then at least I have a starting point there. I can pick up a book or two, and then it's a cross-medial experience.
For sure. That's very cool. All right, last one, and then we'll get out of here. Where do you want to take your content from here? Or do you have a real ambitions for particular ways to grow your site, particular directions you want to explore?
I just do whatever sounds interesting to me. So I think the history and board games posts that we talked about a little bit will probably stay the backbone. But I also have some other things coming up. So there will be a little convention report about here SDHistCon in 2 weeks. I will do a few more strategy articles. Those are always very popular with people. So if you want to know how to play the Protestants in Here I Stand well, or how to win at Imperial Struggle or at Twilight Struggle Red Sea, then I have some tips for you coming over the next few months. And what I would like to do again this year would be another community game like those that we talked about. I don't know yet exactly what I'm going to do, but I have a few ideas about that already, and that I think will be a more social experience for everybody.
For sure. Yeah. And on that front, what's the appeal of the community games for you? Like that's such a different thing than how most people play games. What do you like about it?
It's just great to interact with people about that. So when they make the decisions in polls, then there's a lot of very serious argument about that. And people argue both from the strategic point of view in a game, and sometimes they argue for something that to say maybe that's not a great idea, but it would be fun to do. For example, in one of the unconditional surrender games, we had a Soviet landing in the south of Italy. So that was fun to do as well. And if playing it with people who actually embody a faction, that was great. I had one player who actually changed his avatar on Twitter to have a historical painting of the respective pope, and whenever that pope died in the game and a new pope was coming on, he was changing the picture again, and was just really leaning into the role playing. And people just have very different approaches to that. So there's this full role-playing approach. The Habsburg player in that game was not was more of a very short reply to the briefing that I gave him, but always super fast. I think it was a highlight of his week for him during the pandemic.
Nice.
And and then in comparison to that, I had a Protestant player who is a lawyer in real life. And even if I hadn't known, it would have been so clear from the writing, because it was always, okay, do this. And if it works out, then this. And if not, so. So it was a very intricate structure to what to do with the resources at his disposal. And that was just great fun for me. And I think the players also had fun doing it.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time here, and thank you for all the great historical gaming content you put out. All of us really appreciate it, and thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And if the viewers are interested in what I'm doing, then just visit cliosboardgame.wordpress.com or follow me on Twitter, Clio's Board Games, and would love to get in touch with you.
Perfect. Thank you to everyone for watching, and that's it for this. Enjoy the rest of this con.